met a girl lost in a book, dreaming the past. Follow, she said, and jumped in a page. She smiled and she asked. Walked to Glenfinnan, waited with Charlie. We drank an old leaf, we were toasted by Robbie. We stood as they signed in our broth at the Abbey. She took me to places that I never thought you could see.
Hi, and welcome to Random Scottish History for Independence Live. Off the back of the Mibby's Eye team discussing land reform in Scotland recently, I thought we would do something of a part 2 to the potato clearances episode we did in March on this platform. The clearances were taking place throughout Scotland and the islands from the mid-18th to fairly late on in the 19th centuries, and there's a lot to cover, so we'll get into it. From the Inverness Courier for the 9th of August 1849, we have the North Uist removals from our own correspondent, dated Lochmaddy, Saturday, August 4th, 1849. From the serious nature of the disturbances in the Solas district of North Uist, as reported in the Courier of the 26th ultimo, you deemed it expedient that I should proceed to the island. By the permission of the authorities, I accompanied them in the steamer specially engaged for the service, and as a definite arrangement has at length been determined betwixt Lord Macdonald and the tenantry of the district referred to, I shall now detail what I have seen and ascertained, confining myself in the first place to the proceedings subsequent to the arrival in the island of the superior authorities, and then giving the statement of the people as made to me by themselves. Although an application had been made to the Secretary of State by Lord Macdonald to sanction the presence of military in North Uist, the authorities agreed that before proceeding to that disagreeable step, an effort should be made to give efficacy to the law by employing the county forces only. Accordingly, W.H. Cahoon, Esquire, Principal Sheriff Substitute for the county, started from Inverness on Monday morning last, with a party of 33 constables, under the charge of Mr. McBean, Minister of North Uist, who had arrived at Inverness on Saturday, on his way to the south, but who, at the special request of Mr. Sheriff Tytler, at once agreed to defer his promised journey and to return to the island to assist by his counsels in restoring order. The steamer reached Armadale, Lord Macdonald's wood-environed seat, shortly before 9 o'clock, when Mr. McBean went ashore at the request of the sheriff, and having been introduced to his lordship, informed him that the authorities were on board the steamer and were ready, before proceeding to North Uist, to receive any suggestion his lordship had to make for the better adjustment of matters there. His lordship, however, made no suggestion, but stated that he had just received a communication from Mr. Shaw, Sheriff Substitute for the Long Island, informing him that the people of Solace were still resolved to resist ejectment, and that things remained in the same state as before. The steamer left Armadale at 11 o'clock, and, late as it was, Mr. McCrae at once started for Solace, a distance of at least 10 miles, to exert his influence with the people, of whose determination to resist ejectment, rumours of a serious character prevailed on every hand. Mr. Cooper, Lord Macdonald's commissioner, arrived at an early hour on Wednesday morning by the mail packet from Dunvegan, having been at sea all night. He immediately waited on the authorities and expressed his intention to proceed with the ejectment of the whole population of the district of Solace, unless the offers previously made by him to the people as to emigration were agreed to. The police arrived about midday on the brow of a hill overlooking the 4 towns, where they halted until the sheriffs should arrive. The moment the force was seen from the houses, 3 signals were successfully raised from the roof of one of the bothies occupying the top of a small hill in Dunskeller, and the people from all the neighbouring towns were seen crowding along the paths, leading to the house from which the signals were flying, and around which a large crowd of men, women and children had already assembled. The moment the sheriffs arrived, the march was resumed to Malaglate, where Mr. Shaw and his officers had formerly been deforced. The sheriffs were accompanied by Mr. Cooper, and they were here joined by Mr. MacDonald, the young factor for Lord MacDonald. Arrived at Malaglate, renewed attempts were made by Mr. Cooper and the authorities to obtain the consent of the people to emigrate. The terms formally offered were renewed. The principal heads of families were sent for, and it was explained to them that, should they consent, one or more vessels would be brought immediately to Lochmaddy so that they might be on their way to America in a few days, thus arriving in Canada as early as any emigrants who had ever before left the island. Mr. McCrae and Mr. McBean added their arguments and advices in Gaelic, but the people resolutely persisted in refusing to leave the island, principally for the reason that it was now too late in the season. Several friends who had left the island in the beginning of August last year having written home that they had started too late in the season, and that, though they were now doing well, some of them who had no friends in the new country to aid them with money had been obliged to remain in Quebec or Montreal during the winter, and had suffered some hardships. A promise to go away immediately could not be obtained from more than 4 or 5 families, and Mr. Cooper would not consent to allow the people to remain till next season without a heavy bond from 2 respectable parties that they would all emigrate in the spring and leave as much crop in the ground as was now in it. The Reverend Mr. McCrae at once professed his readiness to become one of the sureties, so that the people might be permitted to remain on their lands till the spring, but another could not be found. In these endeavours the day was passed till a late hour in the afternoon, when, judging that it was now too late to begin a series of ejectments, the authorities resolved upon apprehending some of the ringleaders in the previous deforcements, out of several against whom warrants were issued, and to leave the other proceedings till next day. This did not promise to be an easy matter, for although the demeanour of the men had been quiet and peaceable, almost all the women of the district, young and old, were assembled around a signal raised on the top of an eminence at a short distance, and seemed very much excited. 2 parties, Roderick MacLean and Angus MacPhail, who were recognised in the crowd, were accordingly called and answered to their names, and though they made some little opposition to be handcuffed when made aware that they were prisoners, they yielded, were placed in the centre of the police, and the whole body, with the sheriffs and procurator fiscal, marched off to Lochmaddy. The arrest of the prisoners and the march of the policemen seemed not to be comprehended by their friends, who looked on in wonder, but a moment afterwards the woman raised a continued yell, and seizing stones, rushed down the hill to intercept the march of the officers. The moment was critical, but at the earnest remonstrances of Mr. McCrae and Mr. McBean, the men succeeded in calming the excitement of the woman, and the authorities were permitted to march unmolested to Lochmaddy, where the prisoners were lodged in a place of safety. I confess, however, that I very much doubt whether the authorities would not have been deforced or at least attacked on this occasion, had it not been for the conduct of Mr. McCrae, who remained behind and who, for at least an hour, held the excited crowd around him listening to his earnest and pacific counsels. On Thursday morning, the authorities were early afoot and arrived at Malaglate at 10 o'clock. It was anticipated by the authorities that the arguments used in the arrestments made on Wednesday would have produced good effects, and that some proposals for an arrangement would have been made to Mr. Cooper by the people this morning. No such proposals, however, were made. The people kept their houses, and scarcely a single person was seen by the authorities whilst passing through the district. The work of ejectment then began. The tenant first ejected, named Macpherson, having refused to emigrate when the question was finally put to him. No opposition was made to the law officers, and in 2 or 3 minutes the few articles of furniture he possessed, a bench, a chair, a broken chair, a barrel, a bag of wool, a chest, a spinning wheel, a rough bed frame, a jar, and 2 or 3 small articles comprising his whole household goods and gear, were turned out to the door, and his bothy left roofless. The wife of the prisoner MacPhail was amongst the parties next ejected. Her domestic plenishing was of the simplest character, its greatest and by far its most valuable part being 3 small children. dressed in nothing more than a single coat of coarse blanketing, who played about her knee, whilst the poor woman herself, half-clothed, with a face bathed in tears, and holding an infant in her arms, assured Mr. Cahoon that she and her children were totally destitute and without food. The sheriff very humanely at once dispatched a messenger for the inspector of the poor, also the parish schoolmaster, who lives at a distance of some 4 or 5 miles from Solace, and by whom the woman and her children were in the afternoon placed on the poor's roll. The next adjoining houses were occupied by some poor and infirm old people, and these the sheriff refused to eject, although Mr. Cooper was anxious that they should be removed and provided for elsewhere. It was also discovered at this stage of the proceedings that the charge of ejectment served upon 6 or 8 families in this town were irregular in one particular, and these the sheriffs refused to execute. The next house to which the authorities proceeded was one apparently of a better sort, occupied by John McCaskill, a crofter and weaver, with a wife and family of 9 children. By this time a large crowd of men and women, young and old, had clustered on an eminence at a little distance, and gave the first indication of a hostile feeling by raising repeated shouts as the police advanced, and by throwing a few stones at a party of 8 or 10 men from the opposite end of the island, who had, with difficulty, been prevailed upon by the factor to come to his assistance in unroofing the houses. The police were drawn up in 2 lines along the road, betwixt the houses and the crowd, whilst the sheriff's officers and their assistants proceeded to eject the inmates. The furniture was first brought out, and whilst the men were taking down the loom, Mrs. McCaskill rushed to the front of the house with a child in her arms and cried in a passionate and wailing voice in Gaelic, "My children are being murdered." The excitement amongst the crowd in a moment became tremendous. Numbers of women and young men ran down towards the sea, and the constable stood with batons ready, but the women retreated, crying to the house, and the excitement seemed to be over as quickly as it had arisen. Mr. McBean went up to the crowd and explained what the men were actually doing in the house. He was listened to quietly, but as he returned a stone was thrown at him, and he had scarcely joined his men when a heavy volley of stones drove the assistants from the roof of the house, and a band of from 50 to 100 women, with a few boys and men, came running up from the shore shouting and armed with large stones, with which they compelled the assistants to fall back behind the police for shelter. Fresh supplies of large, sharp-cornered stones were obtained from the bed of a small stream, and several heavy volleys were discharged, most of them, however, falling short of the officers. A momentary lull occurring, the police charged in 2 divisions. One division took the rioters in the rear, when they immediately fled, rushing helter-skelter across the barley rigs, over dykes and through the deep pools in the beach. A number of them were caught between the 2 bodies of police, and 2 men, one young and the other middle-aged, were brought in prisoners with several women. The latter were kept in custody for a few minutes and then discharged, and the ejectment was proceeded with. In this warlike demonstration, a few of the police were struck with stones, and one of the prisoners, before being captured, received a smart blow from a baton. But the determined attitude assumed by the authorities had the effect of checking any further outrage. Most of the elderly men, fearing such an outbreak, had left the spot a few minutes before, and stood looking on in silence at a considerable distance. There they were joined by the greater part of the young men, but the women still crowded together on the hill in a state of the utmost excitement and fury, throwing stones, which could not possibly reach the police, and shouting such wishes as that the men might come down and wash their hands in their enemies' heart's blood, and that the devil and his angels might come and sweep them out of the land. This excitement continued, increased by the frenzy of the friends of the 2 prisoners, till the sheriff accepted Mr. McCrae's bail that they would surrender themselves at Lochmaddy on Saturday morning, when they were discharged with an advice from Mr. Cahoon to go and advise their friends to be quiet. On the liberation of the prisoners, the women went away, and the remainder of the ejectments were proceeded with without opposition from the crowd. The 6th house where ejectment was enforced was that of a widow named McVicker, who was at the time at the seashore picking up cockles. She has 4 children, and was afterwards provided for by the inspector of the poor. At the 8th, both house and outhouse were unroofed. The house appeared unusually well kept, and the poor woman to whose husband it belonged, and who was quite a pattern to her neighbours for cleanliness, followed the sheriffs for several hours with a child in her arms, declaring that she would follow them till they should provide a roof to cover her head. The 9th ejectment was that of a family of Middle Quarter, named Monk, who had taken an active part in all the previous opposition to the authorities. It was found necessary to remove the woman by force. Whilst this ejectment was in course of execution, Mr. Cooper, seeing the determined spirit of the people, and knowing that should the whole ejectments be proceeded with and the stock and crop taken possession of, the expense of maintaining the people during the winter must fall on the parish, agreed to allow them to occupy their houses and lands until the spring, should the heads of families subscribe a pledge to emigrate at any time between the 1st of February next and the end of June, on the terms formerly offered, with the exception only that he would not promise to provide clothes. Messengers were dispatched round the various towns to make this known to the people and to request them to meet Mr. Cooper and the authorities at the schoolhouse of Solace in 2 hours. In the meantime, the ejectment of a 10th family, that of Peter Morrison, formerly Lord Macdonald's ground officer, but who was believed by the managers to have taken an active part in fomenting discontent, was proceeded with. His house was unroofed without opposition, Morrison himself having been absent at the peat moss, and by the time its smoke-blackened rafters were exposed, a considerable number of the heads of families had assembled, who were addressed by Mr. McCrae, but as they did not seem willing to accept Mr. Cooper's proposal, that gentleman and the authorities agreed to give them till next day to consider their final resolution. The authorities then retired to Green Tote, a house about a mile distance, where Mr. Cooper put in writing the terms he had before explained to the people, and a copy was sent to each of the 4 towns. This done, the authorities with their force retired to Lochmaddy, having appointed a meeting with the heads of families at the schoolhouse for next morning at 9 o'clock. Shortly after the hour named, the authorities with Mr. Cooper, Mr. MacDonald the factor, Mr. MacDonald Balranald, Dr. MacDonald and others arrived at the schoolhouse, having preceded the police by an hour. A number of the principal people were found in waiting, when a few put down their names readily, but many still showed great resistance. Partly by the persuasions of Mr. McCrae, of Mr. Shaw and of their friends, others were induced to sign, and whilst the authorities remained at the schoolhouse, Mr. Cooper, with Mr. McNee, the active Procurator Fiscal for the Long Island, went round every tenant in the 4 towns and obtained the signature of every one to a written promise to emigrate to Canada at any period from the 1st of February to the end of June next, at the terms, and with the assistance formerly promised, or that they should then leave the MacDonald estates. This promise was not obtained in several instances until steps had been taken for the destruction of the unwilling party's house. The arrangement thus concluded happily released the authorities from a very disagreeable part of their duty, and the police returned to Lochmaddy early in the day. On Saturday morning, Mr. Cooper, Mr. MacDonald the factor and assistants proceeded to Solace, when, as agreed, the tenantry quietly gave up their cattle and horses to Mr. Cooper at valuation. A cow to give milk and a horse to carry peats from the moss were, however, left with each family. This business having been thus peaceably accomplished, and Mr. Mackay, Procurator Fiscal, having completed the necessary precognitions, the authorities embarked. At 10 o'clock p.m. the steamer got under way, and the bare, barren hills of North Uist are fading behind me. Nor will I regret, but that the wish seems treason to the hospitality I have met with, should they never again rise before me but in memory. The Reverend Mr. McCrae deserves the very highest credit for his conduct throughout this distressing affair. He proved himself a friend to the people, and the sense of his services openly expressed by the authorities necessarily occasions a remark that they regretted the absence of the Reverend Mr. MacDonald, the clergyman of the people, who were almost entirely attached to the Free Church, who did not appear, either to counsel the people in the presence of the authorities, or to assist the latter by his presence. The People's Statement. On Wednesday evening I remained amongst the people and spent several hours with their principal men in one of the houses which was afterwards unroofed, and the following are the statements they made, taken at the moment. About 6 weeks before last Whitsunday term, notice of removal was given. But after that notice, a message was circulated through the district from the office of Mr. MacDonald Balranald, the late factor, to the effect that the people should work well at the tillage, and as cleverly as ever, as there was no certainty that they would be removed. It happened at the same time, by the bounty of Providence, that a great quantity of seaware was cast ashore, and the people set willingly to work and planted more than usual, putting in a large quantity of corn. In fact, many of the people sold clothes, fowls, and eggs to buy seed corn from Pybal and thereabouts to make their cultivation the more abundant, and that a greater quantity than usual might be sown. The next communication received in the district was a charge of removal given on the 30th of June to 12 families, 3 in each farm town, and the whole tenants were served with similar notices a fortnight afterwards. This charge was of removal of goods and gear from the dwelling houses within 48 hours, and from the arable lands at the separation of the crop in November next. Some of those warned off were not in arrears. A few days before the charge was served, Mr. Cooper came to the district and gathered all the people together and pressed them all to emigrate, because the land was set to another person. Mr. Cooper said that they would have a vessel ready in the course of 10 days, from the day on which he spoke to the people, that their arrears would be forgiven, that he would take their stock and crop at valuation and pay their passage to Quebec, and that they should be attended to in Canada. But he would not promise clothes. As he took the stock and crop, he would assist those whose property would not cover their expenses, but he did not say he would return any surplus to those whose stock and crop were of more value. This proposal was made to some who were not in arrear, as well as those who were. Not one of the people would agree to go. They did not wish to leave the island. They thought the offer was not liberal enough, that the season was too far advanced, and that many of them had neither food to maintain themselves for a time in Canada, nor clothes to go away in. Their objections Mr. Cooper treated with little ceremony, declaring that if they would not go, then he would give them a charge and take their stock and cattle from them. 2 officers came as soon as the legal time had elapsed, and from every one of the 12 houses in which charges were first lodged, the tenants were ejected without resistance, and the doors were sealed up. Not one of the houses so sealed up was entered for a fortnight, until all the other charges had been lodged, when the ejected tenants removed the seals and entered their houses. Today, Wednesday, Mr. Cooper again renewed his offer, stating that a ship would be ready in a fortnight, or about the 16th of August. He offered some clothes, but would not state the quantity definitively. Only 5 families agreed to go. The people are very reluctant to go, and not inclined to come to terms. Rent in Solace formerly was seldom paid in money, but in labour. The rent of each 7-acre croft is from £5, or £706 10 today, to £10, or £1,412 20. The average rent is about £7, £988.54, which includes the hill pasture. In Kilmuir and Carinish, some of the tenantry, under the drainage arrangements, have paid by labour 2 years' rent of their crofts in advance, and they had worked for so much that at the last term some of them received in addition from £2, £282.44, to £5 in money to provide stock and supplies. The reason for this partiality is now supposed to be a determination arrived at a long time ago to remove the people of Solace, although it was not made known to them. After the people resisted the officers who wanted to take their cattle, they took the cattle to the market at Lochmaddy to sell, in order to meet a promise they had made to Lord MacDonald that they would pay £4, or £564.88 each after that market. But they found that none of the drovers would buy any beasts from Solace, as the factor had gone amongst the dealers and got them to promise that they would not deal with the Solace people. Since that period, having no money or meal, most of the people had been very ill off. Last year the factor took the cattle for rent when they got no more than £3, or £423.66 for cattle that were worth £6. This year the factor proposed to do the same, but the people thought they themselves could sell them to better profit. In answer to a letter from Mr. Sheriff Shaw, Lord MacDonald some weeks ago sent 300 balls, or 19,051 kilograms, of meal to Lochmaddy, to be distributed to the people. One supply was obtained by the people of the district of Solace, but after the first occurrences, no more meal was issued to them, and they were told they would not get any unless they would sign a paper agreeing to emigrate. This they would not do, and as they had no meal or potatoes, many of them were very ill off and had lived for a fortnight almost solely on milk and shellfish. But as some of the potatoes are now ready, the worst is past. No petition was sent to Lord MacDonald by the crofters praying for assistance to emigrate, and if any such petition was sent, it was by cotters, employed by the Destitution Committee during the winter in road-making at the pound of meal test. But after the charges were served, a letter was sent from the tenantry of the district of Solace, asking his lordship to allow them to remain. Lord MacDonald answered this letter, expressing his fear that should he allow them to remain, their condition would not become better, but worse. Now we can see evidence there that Lord MacDonald had manufactured the situation so that his tenantry couldn't pay him the money that he expected from him. The reason for this is that if the people weren't in arrears, he wouldn't be able to get the authorities to help him in extirpating the people, to help him evict them. That he could only get them to evict the people if they were poor and unable to pay. So he's inspired his factor to go to the dealers and ensure that they don't pay from goods from the people. If they can't sell their goods, then they have to sell them at whatever cost they're offered by Lord MacDonald or his minions, and as we see, they were getting half price for their stock. It was an entirely manufactured events that were happening throughout Scotland. It wasn't for a lack of food. The land had sustained the people for generations. It was only when the lords wanted the land to themselves to do as they wished with it that the people were cleared from it in varying ways. And we see that the people were told that the land was set to another person. Lord MacDonald had promised this extent of land to somebody, and he needed those people gone, and we can see how he was prepared to do anything to make that happen, including attempting to get the military in to do his dirty work for him. We have from Donald MacLeod's Gloomy Memories a chapter entitled The Exiled Barrowman and Their Calumniators. Donald MacLeod compiled not only his own evidence of what was happening in Sutherland, but other people's witness testimony from across Scotland. And the calumniators spoken of in this chapter are people prepared to lie in order to gaslight others into believing a situation that perhaps isn't what it seems. So these calumniators at this time were people that still exist today, people of the likes of Neil Oliver, who are prepared to suggest these people left of their own accord. And we see from that first article that the people didn't want to leave their land. They weren't into it. They were forced to. They were made poor and they were evicted forcibly. To follow these investigations a little further, we cannot do it better than by giving the following well-authenticated communication received from a gentleman who had resided for some time in Barra, and was an eyewitness of the enormities perpetrated there during the summer of 1851. The unfailing and deceitful conduct of those acting for Colonel Gordon in Barra and South Uist last summer cannot be too strongly censured. The duplicity and art which was used by them in order to entrap the unwary natives is worthy of the craft and cunning of an old slave trader. Many of the poor people were told in my hearing that Sir John McNeill would be in Canada before them, where he would have everything necessary for their comfort prepared for them. Some of the officials signed a document binding themselves to emigrate in order to induce the poor people to give their names, but in spite of all these stratagems, many of the people saw through them and refused out and out to go. When the transports anchored in Loch Boisdale, the tyrants threw off their mask, and the work of devastation and cruelty commenced. The poor people were commanded to attend a public meeting at Loch Boisdale, where the transports lay, and according to the intimation, anyone absenting himself from the meeting was to be fined in £2. At this meeting some of the natives were seized and in spite of their entreaties were sent on board the transports. One stout Highlander named Angus Johnston resisted with such pith that they had to handcuff him before he could be mastered. But in consequence of the priest's interference, his manacles were taken off and marched between 4 officers on board the emigrant vessel. One morning during the transporting season, we were suddenly awakened by the screams of a young female who had been recaptured in an adjoining house, having escaped after her first apprehension. We all rushed to the door and saw the broken-hearted creature with dishevelled hair and swollen face dragged away by the 2 constables and a ground officer. Were you to see the racing and chasing of policemen, constables and ground officers pursuing the outlawed natives, you would think, only for their colour, that you had been by some miracle transported to the banks of the Gambia on the slave coast of Africa. The conduct of the Reverend H. Beatson on that occasion is deserving of the censure of every feeling heart. This wolf in sheep's clothing made himself very officious, as he always does when he has an opportunity of oppressing the poor Barrowman and of gaining the favour of Colonel Gordon. In fact, he is the most vigilant and assiduous officer Colonel Gordon has. He may be seen in Castle Bay, the principal anchorage in Barra, whenever a sail is hoisted, directing his men like a gamekeeper with his hounds, in case any of the doomed Barrowmen should escape, so that he might get his land cultivated and improved for nothing. They offered one day to board an Arran boat who had a poor man concealed, but the master, John Crawford, lifted a handspike and threatened to split the skull of the first man who would attempt to board his boat, and thus the poor Barrowmen escaped their clutches. I may state in conclusion that 2 girls, daughter of John MacDougall, brother of Bar MacDougall, whose name is mentioned in Sir John Neill's report, have fled to the mountains to elude the grasp of the expatriators, where they still are if in life. Their father, a frail old man, along with the rest of the family, have been sent to Canada. The respective ages of these girls is 12 and 14 years. Others have fled in the same manner, but I cannot give their names just now. Let us follow the exiled Barrowmen to the New World and witness their deplorable condition and privations in a foreign land. The Quebec Times says, "Many of our readers may not be aware that there lives such a personage as Colonel Gordon, proprietor of large estates, South Uist and Barra in the Highlands of Scotland. We are sorry to be obliged to introduce him to their notice, under circumstances which will not give them a very favourable opinion of his character and heart. It appears that tenants on the above-mentioned estates were on the verge of starvation and had probably become an eyesore to the gallant colonel. He decided on shipping them to America. What they were to do there was a question he never put to his conscience. Once landed in Canada, he had no further concern about them. Up to last week, 1,100 souls from his estates had landed in Quebec and begged their way to Upper Canada, when, in the summer season, having only a morsel of food to procure, they probably escaped the extreme misery which seems to be the lot of those who followed them. On their arrival here, they voluntarily made and signed the following statement. We, the undersigned passengers per Admiral from Stornoway in the Highlands of Scotland, do solemnly depose to the following facts. That Colonel Gordon is the proprietor of the estates of South Uist and Barra, that among many hundreds of tenants and crofters whom he has sent this season from his estates to Canada, he gave directions to his factor, Mr. Fleming of Cluny Castle, Aberdeenshire, to ship on board of the above-named vessel a number of nearly 450 of said tenants and quarters from the estate in Barra, that accordingly a great majority of these people, among whom were the undersigned, proceeded voluntarily to embark on board the Admiral at Loch Boisdale on or about the 11th of August, 1851, but that several of the people who were intended to be shipped for this port, Quebec, refused to proceed on board, and in fact absconded from their homes to avoid embarkation. Whereupon Mr. Fleming gave orders to a policeman who was accompanied by the ground officer of the estate of Barra and some constables to pursue the people who had run away among the mountains, which they did, and succeeded in capturing about 20 from the mountains and islands in the neighbourhood, but only came with the officers on an attempt being made to handcuff them, and that some who ran away were not brought back, in consequence of which 4 families at least have been divided, some having come in the ships to Quebec, while other members of the same families were left in the Highlands. The undersigned further declare that those who voluntarily embarked did so under promise to the effect that Colonel Gordon would defray their passage to Quebec, that the government emigration agent there would send the whole party free to Upper Canada, where, on arrival, the government agents would give them work, and furthermore, grant them land on certain conditions. The undersigned finally declare that they are now landed in Quebec so destitute that if immediate relief be not afforded them and continued until they are settled in employment, the whole will be liable to perish with want. Signed, Hector Lamont and 70 others. This is a beautiful picture. Had the scene been laid in Russia or Turkey, the barbarity of the proceeding would have shocked the nerves of the readers. But when it happens in Britain, emphatically the land of liberty, where every man's house, even the hut of the poorest, is said to be his castle, the expulsion of these unfortunate creatures from their homes, the manhunt with policemen and bailiffs, the violent separation of families, the parents torn from the child, the mother from her daughter, the infamous trickery practised on those who did embark, the abandonment of the aged, the infirm, women and tender children in a foreign land, form a tableau which cannot be dwelt on for an instant without horror. Words cannot depict the atrocity of the deed. For cruelty less savage, the dealers of the South have been held up to the execration of the world. And if, as men, the sufferings of these our fellow creatures find sympathy in our hearts, as Canadians, their wrongs concern us more dearly. The 1,500 souls whom Colonel Gordon has sent to Quebec this season have all been supported for the past week at least and conveyed to Upper Canada at the expense of the colony, and on their arrival in Toronto and Hamilton, the greater number have been dependent on the charity of the benevolent for their morsel of bread. 400 are in the river at present and will arrive in a day or two, making a total of nearly 2,000 of Colonel Gordon's tenants and cotters whom the province has to support. The winter is at hand. Work is becoming scarce in Upper Canada. Where are these people to find food? The clearances, I feel, were part of landowners' attempt to shake off and shirk everything that prevented them from having full freedom of the lands they held, the responsibilities that came with the land. From the Leaving Advertiser and Weems Gazette for the 24th of October, 1912. At one time, all the public burdens were borne by the land because landholders got the land from the state on certain conditions. These conditions were that they provided fighting material in time of war, that they kept up the church, that they looked after the poor, and contributed to education. These were the obligation in return for which they got the land. The burdens had been gradually shifted to other shoulders until today the land only paid 4% of the taxation. Without people on their land, there weren't people to go to the church for the church to be needed to be upkept. There weren't people needing to be educated for schools needing funding. There weren't poor that needed help. When it came to Britain's wars in the latter half of the 19th century, it was found fairly difficult to round up even a quarter or a fifth of the numbers that had previously been gathered in times of war in order to supply the British Army with fodder. These young men, from the end of the 18th century right through the 19th, were going away, fighting in British wars, in foreign lands, with distinction. They were distinguished and they were constantly shown in the press and in literature as to how morally uncorruptible these Highlanders were and these Scotsmen were. They were some of the best soldiers that the British Army had to offer. And these young men were coming home to find that entire villages they had formerly resided in were no longer in existence, that their families were no longer even residing in Scotland, that they had been conned into embarking on these ships to Canada under a promise that there was support for them there. There was no support for them. Let's have a wee look at some of the plethora of land sale advertisements which show in themselves the end of the run rig form of tenancy, the sharing of land amongst many families. From the Caledonian Mercury for the 20th of August 1750, we have that the lands in estate of Kinneil and Borristoness and other lands within the shires of Linlithgow and Stirling, belonging to His Grace the Duke of Hamilton, being now surveyed and laid into proper farms, without any run-rig grounds, and having new farmhouses and office houses built upon many of the several farms, are to be let for 19 years, commencing at the term of Martinmas next. This is to be done by public group at Borristoness upon Wednesday the 10th of October. The Cali Mercury for the 10th of July 1771. The Commissioner in the process of division of the run-rig lands of Tranent hereby give notice to all persons concerned therein that there is a plan and scheme of division of said lands now made out, but before reporting the same to the Court of Session he has ordered that the said plan and scheme of division, with the proof of possession taken by him, shall lie in the hands of David Mather, land surveyor in Tranent, until the 25th July instant, and thereafter to be transmitted to James Walker, writer to the signet at his house in the Society, and to lie in his hands until the 20th day of August next, for the inspection of all concerned. And the Commissioner required all parties who may have any objections to the said scheme and plan to transmit the same in writing to Alexander Fraser, Sheriff Clerk of Haddington, the clerk to the said Commission, on or before the 24th day of the said month of August, with certification that no objections will be afterwards received, but all parties will be held as acquiescing in said plan and scheme of division. And the Commissioner also ordered that this public intimation should be twice inserted in each of the 3 Edinburgh newspapers, that none may pretend ignorance thereof. Now, if you consider that John F. Campbell was able to go around the Highlands and Islands of Scotland amongst the general population, obtaining Highland tales, popular tales, 80 years after this article came out, and the stories that he was collecting were solely from illiterate, Gaelic-only speaking people, that these people were common, how were they to object in writing to something that was being published in newspapers? How were they to know about it? How were they to go about entering their disapproval of the plans to enclose their lands? Finally, from these advertisements, the Cali Mercury for Thursday the 24th of July 1794. Barony of Grudes, Sutherlandshire. Timious notice is hereby given to farmers and crofters that the leases upon that extensive property will expire at Whitsunday 1796, and as few Highland districts present more advantageous inducements in either the cattle or sheep farming line, or both, those having any such views cannot, it is presumed, be more happily situated. The barony is situated in nearly the most western extremity of the county of Sutherland. Its boundaries are well ascertained and marked, and the property contiguous and uninterrupted. Its extent is from 27 to 30 miles in length, from southeast to northwest, and from about 4 to 8 miles upon an average in breadth, the greatest breadth being towards the southern extremity. The proportion of arable land is equal to, if not beyond, what is generally to be met with on properties of the like extent in the North Highlands. The eastern boundary is entirely water, by Loch Shin, about 27 miles long, whereof 9 to 12 miles on the southwest shore is a fine skirting of birch wood, and about from 3 to 4 miles of the River Shin, boldly issuing out of the loch on which there is a cobble ferry. The river runs further from 3 to 4 miles from the southern extremity of this property and falls into the Dornoch Firth at Invershin. Very little labour and expense may make a most excellent carriage road from the loch end to the Dornoch Firth, being only about 7 miles, chiefly on a hard, rocky and gravelly bottom, and the western extremity also of Loch Shin is but a trifling distance from water communication with the western sea. The whole estate will be either let entire or in separate farms on lease from 7 to 19 years as offerers may induce. Further information may be had by applying to Messrs. Davidson and Graham of London, trustees of the estates of Sir George Munro of Poinsfield, deceased, to Major George Sutherland at Rearcher, by Dornoch, one of their factors, or to George Andrew, writer in Edinburgh. There were efforts on behalf of land reform, and those crofters residing on Scottish lands, which tended to go hand in hand with calls for Home Rule, and the establishment of a Scottish Parliament as local legislation by the people who lived here, seemed an obvious solution to a plethora of problems. From the Scotsman for the 26th of April 1886, the Scottish Land Reform Alliance and Home Rule. A meeting of the General Committee of the Scottish Land Reform Alliance was held on Saturday at St Catherine's Buildings, Aberdeen, to consider what steps should be taken by the Alliance to further the legislation for Scotland for which it is striving, and to consider Scottish bills at present before Parliament. Mr J.S. Findlater Balvenie presided. The President afterwards explained that the object for calling the meeting was because Mr Gladstone had stated that until the Irish business was managed, there would be no legislation in Parliament, either for Englishmen or Scotsmen. If their chances of legislation were kept in the background forever, they would never get what they wanted. The members they sent to Parliament to represent them were in a useless minority, and they got sat upon. And the Whig newspapers, the great leaders of liberal opinion, like the Scotsman, had nothing to say but, "Look at these men, they are only making a bother." Until they got a Parliament of their own, until they got their own national business done by purely Scotch members, they would never get the legislation they wanted. They wanted Home Rule as much as Ireland, though not such Home Rule as would separate them from the Imperial Parliament, as that was a thing Scotland would not for a moment hear of. A good deal of discussion took place as to whether it would be in accordance with the constitution of the Alliance to pass such a resolution as Mr Maccombie proposed, and ultimately it was withdrawn in favour of the following motion, substituted by the President. This resolution was adopted, Mr J.D. Scott Hill of Ruthven, Perth, dissenting, considering that they were going beyond the province of the Alliance in meddling with Irish affairs at all, and a great deal of harm would be done to the Alliance by driving things too fast. Messrs Ray, Haddo, Kincardine, Japp, Newton, Kincardine, Maccombie, Milton of Kemnay, and Alexander, Ballindarg, Forfar, were appointed a deputation to wait on the Scottish Secretary in Edinburgh, to urge that the Crofters' Bill be extended to the whole of Scotland and to apply to leaseholders and cottagers. The deputation were also directed to support the Game Laws Amendment Bill. Speaking of game and the landowner's propensity for preferring animals over people, we have the Scotsman for the 29th of July 1926. Scottish Night in Parliament. Land reform, education and housing, debate opened, land question. Mr Adamson, Socialist, West Fife, congratulated the Secretary for Scotland on the restoration of the office which he had held to the status of that of a Secretaryship of State. He assured the right honourable gentleman that that was a change which met with the approval of all sections of the people of Scotland. He also congratulated the right honourable gentleman on his decision to visit the islands of Orkney and Shetland in the autumn of this year. It was a very good thing for one who held his position to make himself acquainted with as many of the problems facing the people he represented as he possibly could. With regard to the raising of the status of the Secretaryship of Scotland to that of a Secretaryship of State, the abolition of that status in the far-off days was a link in the chain of events which had led to a condition of affairs in a large part of Scotland which he wanted to discuss. The struggle, which had culminated in the abolition of the office of Secretary of State for Scotland, had involved the break-up of a system of government which had given to the people of the pastoral part of Scotland the same indefeasible right to the ownership of the land on which they lived and worked as was possessed by the chieftains under whom they lived. The next step in this chain of events was that in many parts of Scotland the people were driven off the land. Today they had millions of acres of land lying idle, or at least converted into deer forests, and kept in that idle condition for the sport of a few millionaires, who in many instances did not belong to the country at all. People had had to live under conditions that were a discredit to every government that had been in office, while millions of acres were being reserved for a few wealthy men and women. It was the duty of every Scottish member to take every step to get the land restored to their own people for their own use. During his own brief period of office, he had under consideration the best means for changing the system of the land tenure, with a view to restoring the land to the people for their use under easier conditions than had been the case for many years past. He had under consideration at the same time the question of transport facilities, which were equally necessary if they were to develop agriculture in the Highlands. They had also under consideration a scheme of cooperation that would have enabled the agricultural population in that part of Scotland to get the full fruits of their labours once they had got them onto the land under proper conditions. Had they been in office as long as some governments had been, everything possible to carry out that programme would have been done. Sir Robert Horne, the land problem. Sir R. Horne, Unionist, Glasgow, Hillhead, was able to congratulate the new Secretary for State for Scotland upon the moderation of those speeches and the lack of any attack upon his administration. Outside common sense. 3 of the speeches had dealt with entirely local matters, but the speech of the Right Honourable Member for West Fife had dealt with a bigger subject. The main theme of it was that very much more cultivation of the land was required than was at present being devoted in Scotland. That was a question in which every Scotsman was intensely interested. It must be said that every effort had been made in recent years by all governments which had been dealing with this problem to restore people to the land, and wherever it was possible to create a thrifty and prosperous rural population. But he would like to enter one caveat. The Right Honourable Member for West Fife, in his enthusiasm, talked about millions of uncultivated acres in Scotland devoted to the pleasures of the rich, deer forests and grouse shooting. He, Sir Robert Horne, had travelled over a great many of those acres, and it was quite outside the region of common sense to talk about many of them as acres on which they could produce any form of cultivation. Blossom like the rose. Anybody who talked about the millions of acres of deer forests being used for cultivation was completely refuted by the Commission. It was absurd to say that deer forests and grouse moors were capable of raising crops. The Forestry Commission were dealing with the areas in which timber could be grown. Everyone who knew the conditions in Scotland would agree that the amount of land devoted to sport at the present time was a very great source of revenue to the country, and without which its resources would be depleted to such an extent as would raise the rates of these districts far above what the community could bear. The amount contributed by shooting tenants was something with which Scotland could not dispense, but to make the hilltops of Scotland and its grouse moors blossom like the rose was a fallacy, and one of the dreams of Mr. Adamson which were never capable of realisation. Shooting rents and rates. Mr. James Brown, Socialist, South Ayrshire, said he thought every Scotsman knew that the depopulation of the Highlands was not towards the towns, and was not voluntary depopulation. Generally speaking, men and women who left the countryside to go into the towns did so in order to find employment. That was not so regarding the depopulation of the Highlands, which was one of the saddest tales in the sad annals of their country. He did not think the member for West Fife thought they could make the hilltops blossom like the rose, but what they did want was that the valleys should be repopulated. He did not think the rents got from the shooting tenants and the rates levied on them came to very much, not anything like Sir Robert Horne imagined when it came to enabling Scotland to move on. He thought Scotland could do without it, and stand on its own feet. There were descendants of Scotsmen in Canada and the colonies whose grandfathers and great-grandfathers had to leave the country because they could not get a foothold in the country, owing to the space allowed for plutocrats from other countries to come in and take the land their forefathers had cultivated. Mr. T. Johnson, Socialist for Dundee, referring to the speech made by Sir Robert Horne, said it was absolute rubbish to state that the land covered by deer in Scotland was fit for nothing else. The statement had been disproved by royal commissions and committees. The ownership of large swathes of the country in very few hands throughout Scotland has been a long-standing problem, and was something that was exacerbated by everything that's been mentioned so far. The Edinburgh Evening News for the 8th of February 1894. Has Mr. Shaw MP on land reform? At a largely attended public meeting in the Town Hall, Galashiels, last night, under the auspices of the Liberal Association, Mr. Thomas Shaw MP delivered a lecture on the Scottish land laws. Mr. Shaw said that the land legislation was the solution of many difficulties. Unless land reform was carried on without delay, there would be a land revolution which would afford a golden opportunity to anarchists and socialists. After dealing at considerable length with the present inequalities of the land laws, he quoted official statistics to prove that the great bulk of land was owned not by the people, but by a small number of landowners. Mr. Shaw said the latest official statistics are still those to be found in the returns moved for by the late Earl of Derby on the 19th of February 1872. Mackay, in his work on free trade in land, justly holds the return with regard to Scotland to be still more startling than those for England and Wales. Now, what do these returns show? The total acreage of Scotland is 18,946,694 acres. One owner alone has 1,326,000 acres in Scotland, and also 32,095 in England, or a total of 1,358,548 acres. 12 owners have 4,339,722 acres, or nearly 1/4 of the whole of Scotland, or, in other words, a tract of country larger than the whole of Wales and equal in size to 8 English counties, viz. Bedfordshire, Berkshire, Buckinghamshire, Cambridgeshire, Cheshire, Cornwall, Cumberland and Derbyshire. This is startling enough, but let us proceed. 70 owners have about 9,400,000 acres, or about 1/2 of Scotland, while 9/10 of the whole of Scotland, that is, the whole of 18,946,694 acres, belong to fewer than 1,700 persons. Or, take a look at the counties. One man owns 1/4 of the large county of Forfar, one man 1/4 of Orkney, one man 1/4 of Roxburgh, one man 1/4 of Stirling, one man 1/4 of Wigton. 5 counties, in short, in Scotland have 1/4 of each of their entire areas, owned by a single proprietor. Take other 5 counties, viz. Banff, Dumbarton, Dumfries, Elgin and Selkirk. In each of these shires, not less than 1/3 of its entire area is owned by a single proprietor. 3/4 of the entire area of the county of Bute is owned by a single man, and this is also the case in another shire, viz. that of Cromarty. The county of Sutherland tops the list. Out of 1,299,253 acres, one proprietor owns no less than the vast area of 1,176,454 acres, not to speak of his dominions in other counties and in England. Mr. Shaw, going on to speak of the best remedies for the state of matters, said he would abolish primogeniture with its attendant lesser evils, and, secondly, he would equalise in its entirety the whole law of movable and heritable properties, and that, despite any will to the contrary which may have been made by the testator. He claimed that his proposal, if adopted, would abolish the injustices of the present land laws. Scots successfully reopened their parliament in July of 1999, but without the full powers Home Rule would have assured us. Yet, these problems still persist. We can only thank our contemporary activists as well as those who came before for their efforts on our behalf. If you can, please support their varying causes throughout Scotland. Petitions and questionnaires are available online, allowing you to make a contribution towards our future. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the information I have for you this episode, and we may see you again for the next one. Take care.